Every year, over 3.5 million truck drivers traverse America's highways, hauling cargo across distances that would break most people's sanity. They drive through the darkest hours when the rest of us sleep safely in our beds, navigating stretches of road so remote that cell towers become distant memories, and the nearest help could be hundreds of miles away. What happens out there, in those endless corridors of asphalt that slice through America's most desolate landscapes, defies explanation and challenges everything we think we know about the world around us. Tonight, I'm going to share with you 10 documented cases that will make you question whether you'd ever want to drive alone at night again. These aren't urban legends passed down through truck stop coffee conversations or stories embellished over CB radio chatter. These are real incidents, backed by police reports, witness testimonies, and, in some cases, physical evidence that investigators still can't explain. Before we dive into these spine-chilling accounts that have haunted the trucking community for decades, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because you are going to want to follow this channel for more terrifying true stories that will keep you awake at night. The first case I'm about to tell you involves a veteran driver named Marcus, who had been hauling freight for 22 years without a single incident, until one foggy October night in 2019 when he picked up a hitchhiker on Interstate 80 in Nevada who claimed to have been waiting on that exact spot for 37 years. What Marcus discovered about this passenger, and what that passenger knew about Marcus that no stranger should ever know, will fundamentally change how you view those lonely figures you sometimes see standing by highway on-ramps in the middle of nowhere. Story 1. The Waiting Man. Marcus Delgado had been driving trucks for 22 years, accumulating over 2 million miles without a single major incident. He was the kind of driver other truckers respected, always on time, never complained, and kept his rig in pristine condition. His wife, Sarah, often joked that he knew every rest stop, way station, and truck stop from Seattle to Miami better than he knew their own neighborhood. On October 15, 2019, Marcus was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver, a route he'd driven at least 50 times before. The weather forecast had warned of fog rolling in from the Pacific, but Marcus had driven through worse conditions and wasn't concerned. His delivery wasn't due until Thursday afternoon, giving him plenty of time to take it slow if visibility became an issue. Around 10:30 that night, somewhere between Fernley and Lovelock on Interstate 80, the fog hit with an intensity that shocked even Marcus. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet, forcing him to reduce his speed to barely 30 miles per hour. The fog wasn't the typical patchy Nevada desert fog he'd encountered before. This was thick, almost oily, and seemed to swallow his headlight beams completely. His CB radio crackled with chatter from other drivers reporting similar conditions, with several pulling over to wait it out. Marcus considered doing the same, but he knew this stretch of highway well and felt confident he could navigate slowly until the fog lifted. That's when he saw the figure standing by the on-ramp near mile marker 48. Even through the thick fog, Marcus could make out the silhouette of a man with his thumb extended, clearly looking for a ride. Marcus had a strict policy against picking up hitchhikers, a rule he'd maintained throughout his entire career after hearing too many horror stories from fellow drivers. But something about this particular night, maybe the isolation or the eerie way the fog seemed to part just enough for him to see the man clearly, made him reconsider. The hitchhiker appeared to be middle-aged, wearing what looked like a dark jacket and jeans, standing perfectly still with an almost supernatural patience. Against his better judgment and 22 years of experience, Marcus pulled over. The air brakes hissed as he brought the 18-wheeler to a stop about 50 feet past the on-ramp. Through his passenger mirror, he watched the man walk toward the truck with a measured, deliberate pace that seemed oddly rhythmic. When the passenger door opened, Marcus got his first clear look at his unexpected guest. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and weathered features that suggested he'd spent considerable time outdoors. His clothes looked dated, not vintage or retro, but genuinely old, as if they'd been worn continuously for decades. "Appreciate the ride," the man said as he climbed into the cab, his voice carrying a slight rasp. That reminded Marcus of longtime smokers. "Name's David Thornfield." There was something about the way he said his name, with a formality that seemed rehearsed, that immediately put Marcus on edge. "I'm Marcus. Where you heading?" Marcus asked, trying to shake off the growing unease settling in his stomach. "Denver," David replied without hesitation. "Been waiting for someone heading to Denver for quite some time." The way he emphasized "quite some time" sent an inexplicable chill through Marcus, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. As they merged back onto the interstate, the fog seemed to thicken even more, if that was possible. Marcus found himself relying almost entirely on the reflective lane markers to stay on track. David sat quietly in the passenger seat, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. After about 15 minutes of silence, David spoke again. "You've got a daughter named Emma, don't you, Marcus? She's studying pre-med at UC Davis, planning to specialize in emergency medicine." Marcus's blood ran cold. He'd never mentioned his daughter to anyone on the road, and the specific details about her career plans weren't something he discussed casually, even with close friends. "How do you know about my daughter?" Marcus demanded, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. David turned to look at him directly for the first time since getting in the truck, and Marcus noticed his eyes seemed to reflect the dashboard lights in an unnatural way. "I know a lot of things about you, Marcus. Like how you've been having those dreams about the accident that happened on this exact stretch of highway 37 years ago. The one where the entire Thornfield family died when their car went off the road during a fog just like this one." The temperature in the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees, and Marcus realized with growing horror that David had just claimed to be from the family that died decades before he'd even started driving this route. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered, but even as he said it, fragmented memories of recurring nightmares began surfacing. Dreams he'd pushed aside and forgotten, dreams about a family driving through fog, about screams and twisted metal, about voices calling for help that never came. "You've been having those dreams because you were supposed to stop that night," David continued, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "October 15th, 1982. You were supposed to be driving this route, supposed to see our car go off the road, supposed to call for help, but you didn't become a trucker until 5 years later, did you, Marcus? 5 years too late." The fog outside began to swirl in patterns that defied physics, forming shapes that looked almost like reaching hands. Marcus's CB radio burst to life with static that gradually formed into voices, multiple voices overlapping in desperate pleas for help. Through the static, he could make out fragments of conversation. "Please, someone help us. The car's going over. We can't get out." David's form in the passenger seat began to flicker, becoming translucent one moment and solid the next. "We've been waiting, Marcus. 37 years of waiting for the driver who was meant to save us. Every October 15th in fog like this, we come back to this spot, hoping the right trucker will finally come along." Marcus slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a shuddering halt on the shoulder. When he turned to confront David, the passenger seat was empty except for a lingering smell of burnt metal and something else he couldn't identify. On the seat where David had been sitting, Marcus found a yellowed newspaper clipping dated October 16th, 1982. The headline read, "Family of 4 dies in highway accident during fog." Below the headline was a photograph of David Thornfield, his wife, and 2 young children, all killed when their car skidded off Interstate 80 near mile marker 48 during a thick fog. The article mentioned that their car wasn't discovered until 2 days later because no other drivers had witnessed the accident or stopped to help. Marcus sat in his truck for over an hour, staring at the newspaper clipping and trying to process what had just happened. The fog gradually began to lift, revealing the desert landscape he knew so well, but nothing looked the same anymore. When he finally felt composed enough to continue driving, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. His logbook, which he'd filled out meticulously before starting his trip, now showed an entry he didn't remember making. In his own handwriting, it read, October 15th, 2019, mile marker 48. Stopped to help accident victims. The Thornfield family. Below that, in the same handwriting but somehow different, more desperate, were the words, Some debts follow you across time, and some passengers never really leave. Marcus completed his delivery to Denver, but he never drove that road again. He sold his truck 3 weeks later and took a job at a local warehouse, refusing to explain to his family why he'd suddenly abandoned the career he'd loved for over 2 decades. Sarah noticed that he'd started having nightmares every October 15th, waking up screaming about fog and voices calling for help. The newspaper clipping disappeared from their house sometime in November, but Marcus swears he still sees David Thornfield standing by on-ramps late at night, always in the same clothes, always with the same patient expression, still waiting for the next driver who was supposed to stop but didn't. The official records show that the Thornfield accident was never solved, listed as a single-vehicle incident with no witnesses. But truckers who drive Interstate 80 through Nevada have reported similar encounters for decades, always on foggy October nights, always near mile marker 48. They describe picking up a middle-aged man who knows impossible details about their lives and speaks of waiting for someone who never came. Most drivers, unlike Marcus, never make it to their destinations. Their trucks are found abandoned on the side of the highway, engines still running, driver doors hanging open, with no trace of the drivers ever found. The only clue investigators consistently discover is the lingering smell of burnt metal and something else they can't identify, something that reminds witnesses of old graves and forgotten promises. Story 2. The Cargo That Watched Back. Rebecca Martinez had been driving for 8 years, specializing in high-value cargo transportation across the southwestern United States. At 34, she was one of the most trusted drivers in her company's fleet, known for her meticulous attention to detail and unwavering professionalism. Her spotless safety record and reputation for handling sensitive shipments had earned her the respect of both her employers and clients. Rebecca took pride in never asking questions about her cargo, understanding that discretion was as valuable as punctuality in her line of work. She'd transported everything from medical equipment to art pieces worth millions, maintaining the same level of care regardless of the shipment's nature or destination. On November 8, 2021, Rebecca received an unusual assignment that would fundamentally alter her perception of reality. The pickup location was a nondescript warehouse facility outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the destination was a research facility in Flagstaff, Arizona. What made this job unusual wasn't the route, which she'd driven dozens of times before, but the complete lack of information provided about the cargo itself. The shipping manifest listed only biological research materials, temperature-controlled, extremely fragile, do not inspect. The client, listed as Meridian Bio Research Institute, had paid triple the normal rate for overnight delivery with a strict requirement that the trailer remain sealed and climate-controlled at exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the entire journey. When Rebecca arrived at the pickup facility, she was met by 3 men in white laboratory coats who supervised the loading process with an intensity that immediately struck her as excessive. They used electronic tablets to monitor the trailer's temperature constantly and installed additional security seals beyond what was standard for high-value cargo. Dr. Alan Krieger, who appeared to be the lead scientist, approached Rebecca's cab window after the loading was complete. "Ms. Martinez, I cannot stress enough how critical it is that this cargo reach Flagstaff without any delays or temperature fluctuations. The materials we're transporting are extremely sensitive to environmental changes, and any deviation from our specifications could result in catastrophic loss." His emphasis on the word catastrophic carried a weight that suggested consequences far beyond financial loss. The first hour of the journey proceeded normally as Rebecca navigated through Albuquerque's evening traffic and onto Interstate 40 westbound. The specialized trailer she was pulling was equipped with a state-of-the-art refrigeration unit and multiple backup systems to maintain the precise temperature requirements. Her dashboard displayed real-time readings from sensors throughout the cargo area, confirming that everything was functioning perfectly. The sun was setting as she passed through Grants, New Mexico, painting the high desert landscape in brilliant oranges and purples. Rebecca had always found this particular drive beautiful, especially during sunset, but tonight something felt different about the familiar scenery. Around 9:30, approximately 2 hours into her journey, Rebecca began noticing irregularities in the trailer's sensor readings. The temperature fluctuations were minimal, never varying more than half a degree from the target, but the patterns seemed oddly rhythmic rather than random. The variations occurred in consistent intervals, almost like a heartbeat or breathing pattern. When she called the 24-hour support line for the refrigeration company, the technician assured her that such minor fluctuations were well within normal parameters and posed no threat to temperature-sensitive cargo. Despite this reassurance, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with her shipment. As she climbed into the higher elevations approaching Flagstaff, the temperature fluctuations became more pronounced and definitely more rhythmic. What disturbed Rebecca most was that the patterns seemed to be responding to external stimuli. When she honked her horn at a slow-moving vehicle, the sensor readings spiked noticeably. When she turned up her radio, the fluctuations accelerated. When she reduced her speed for a construction zone, the patterns became more erratic, almost agitated. Rebecca had transported temperature-sensitive medical supplies and biological materials before, but she'd never encountered cargo that seemed to react to its environment in such an interactive way. Around 11 o'clock, still an hour from her destination, Rebecca pulled into a truck stop near Winona to conduct a mandatory inspection of her refrigeration equipment. As she walked around the trailer, she noticed that the refrigeration unit was running more frequently than normal, cycling on and off in the same rhythmic pattern she'd been observing on her sensors. More disturbing was the sound coming from inside the trailer itself. Beneath the mechanical humming of the cooling system, she could hear what sounded like scratching or tapping, as if something inside was moving against the walls. When she pressed her ear closer to the trailer's side panel, the sounds stopped immediately, then resumed with increased intensity when she stepped away. Rebecca contacted Dr. Krieger's emergency number, but her call went straight to voicemail. Her attempts to reach the Meridian Bio Research Institute yielded only an automated system that provided no option for reaching a live person. Growing increasingly concerned about the condition of her cargo, she decided to inspect the trailer's interior despite the explicit instructions to maintain the seals. Using her master key, she carefully opened the rear doors, immediately hit by a blast of frigid air that carried an odor she couldn't identify, something organic and unsettling, that reminded her of hospitals and morgues combined. The trailer's interior was lined with specialized containers arranged in precise rows, each one approximately the size of a large coffin and connected to individual climate control systems. What made Rebecca's blood run cold was the realization that the containers weren't sealed units as she'd expected. Each one had a small viewing window, and through the frost-covered glass, she could see movement inside. The scratching sounds she'd been hearing were coming from within the containers themselves, as if their contents were trying to get out. As her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she could make out shapes behind the frosted glass that looked disturbingly human in form. Rebecca slammed the trailer doors shut and immediately called 911, but her cell phone showed no signal despite being in an area where she'd never had coverage problems before. She tried her CB radio, but every channel produced only static mixed with what sounded like voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. As she stood beside her truck trying to decide what to do next, she noticed that the trailer was now rocking slightly on its suspension, as if something inside was moving with considerable force. The temperature readouts on her dashboard were fluctuating wildly, and the refrigeration unit was cycling continuously in patterns that seemed almost desperate. Against every instinct screaming at her to abandon the cargo and drive away, Rebecca made the decision to complete her delivery to Flagstaff. As she pulled back onto the interstate, the movement inside the trailer became more violent, causing the entire rig to sway unpredictably. The scratching sounds were now audible even over the road noise and her radio, accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices or cries. Her dashboard sensors showed temperature spikes that should have triggered multiple alarms, but somehow all the warning systems remained silent. When she tried calling Dr. Krieger again, his voicemail greeting had changed to a message she'd never heard before. The subjects have awakened earlier than anticipated. Maintain current protocols until transfer is complete. Do not, under any circumstances, open the containment units. The final 30 minutes of Rebecca's journey became a nightmare of mechanical failures and inexplicable phenomena. Her truck's electrical systems began malfunctioning, with lights flickering and the radio cycling through stations on its own. The trailer's movement became so violent that she had to reduce her speed to maintain control, while the sounds from inside evolved from scratching and tapping to what could only be described as systematic pounding, as if multiple entities were trying to break through their containers simultaneously. When she finally reached the Meridian Bio-Research Facility, she found the building completely dark with no signs of activity, despite the late-night delivery being specifically requested. Rebecca backed up to the loading dock and honked her horn repeatedly, but no one emerged from the facility. After waiting 20 minutes, she noticed that the violent movement inside her trailer had suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. When she checked her dashboard, all the temperature sensors showed normal readings for the first time since leaving Albuquerque. The facility remained dark and unresponsive, but a new smell began emanating from her trailer, something that reminded her of ozone and burnt metal mixed with organic decay. At 12:45 in the morning, 3 unmarked black vehicles arrived at the facility, followed by what appeared to be a hazmat team in full protective gear. The men who emerged from the vehicles wore no identifying badges or uniforms, but they moved with military precision and seemed to know exactly what they were dealing with. They ordered Rebecca to step away from her truck and wait in a designated area while they handled the cargo transfer. Through the loading dock's partially open door, she could see additional personnel inside the facility, all wearing the same protective gear and moving with the same urgent efficiency. The transfer process took nearly 3 hours, during which Rebecca was not allowed to approach her trailer or observe the unloading procedures. She could hear mechanical equipment, possibly forklifts or cranes, and occasional radio communications between the hazmat team members, but their conversations were conducted in technical jargon and code words she didn't understand. What she did notice was that the containers being removed from her trailer were no longer the same ones she'd loaded in Albuquerque. These were larger, made of different materials, and required considerably more personnel to handle safely. When the transfer was finally complete, the team leader approached Rebecca with a document that she was required to sign, acknowledging successful delivery despite the obvious discrepancies. Rebecca drove her empty trailer back to Albuquerque in a state of shock, trying to process what she'd experienced. Her logbook, which she'd maintained meticulously throughout the journey, now contained entries she didn't remember making, written in her own handwriting but describing events that contradicted her memories. According to the official records, she'd transported standard biological research materials without incident, completing the delivery ahead of schedule with perfect temperature maintenance throughout the journey. When she tried to discuss the night's events with her dispatcher, she was informed that Meridian Bio-Research Institute had no record of requesting her services, and the company that had arranged the shipment appeared to have no legal existence. 3 weeks later, Rebecca received a substantial bonus payment along with a letter thanking her for her discretion and professionalism. The letter was signed by Dr. Krieger, but when she tried to contact him, she discovered that no such person was affiliated with any research institution in the Southwest. Her attempts to investigate Meridian Bio-Research Institute led to dead ends and contradictory information, as if the organization existed only temporarily when needed for specific purposes. Rebecca continued driving for 2 more months, but she began experiencing nightmares about containers with viewing windows and the sound of something scratching to get out. She eventually left the trucking industry entirely, moving to a small town in Oregon where she now works at a local hardware store and refuses to discuss her previous career with anyone. The warehouse facility outside Albuquerque where Rebecca picked up her cargo was demolished 6 months after her delivery, with no explanation provided to local authorities. The lot remains vacant, but truck drivers passing through the area report strange electrical interference with their vehicles when they stop nearby. Some have described hearing scratching sounds coming from empty trailers, while others claim their temperature-controlled cargo develops the same rhythmic fluctuations that Rebecca experienced. The Meridian Bio-Research Facility in Flagstaff officially never existed, but local residents occasionally report seeing unmarked vehicles and personnel in hazmat suits working at the abandoned building during late-night hours. Whatever Rebecca transported that November night, and whatever happened to the contents of those containers, remains classified under security protocols that most government agencies claim to know. Story 3. The Convoy That Never Existed. Thomas Tank. Williams earned his nickname during 15 years of military service before transitioning to long-haul trucking in 2018. At 42, he brought the same methodical precision to his driving that had made him an exemplary sergeant in the Army's Transportation Corps. Tank specialized in overnight runs across the Midwest, preferring the solitude of empty highways and the steady rhythm of long-distance hauling. His military background made him naturally observant, always aware of his surroundings and quick to notice anything unusual on the road. Tank maintained detailed logs of his routes, fuel stops, and any incidents he encountered, a habit that would prove crucial in documenting one of the most disturbing experiences in trucking history. On March 22, 2022, Tank was hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Kansas City, a route he'd driven over 40 times without incident. The weather was clear with light traffic, perfect conditions for making good time across Illinois and Missouri. Around 2:30 in the morning, while traveling westbound on Interstate 70 through central Illinois, Tank noticed headlights approaching rapidly in his mirrors. The lights belonged to what appeared to be a convoy of trucks, all maintaining precise formation and traveling at exactly the same speed. Tank initially assumed they were military vehicles conducting a training exercise, but as they drew closer, he realized they were civilian 18-wheelers identical to his own rig in every detail except color. The convoy consisted of 7 trucks, all painted in a deep black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They maintained perfect spacing between vehicles, approximately 50 feet apart, and traveled in the left lane at exactly 75 miles per hour. What immediately struck Tank as unusual was their synchronized movement. When one truck made a lane adjustment, all 7 moved in perfect unison, as if controlled by a single driver. Their headlight patterns were also identical, creating an almost hypnotic effect as they approached. Tank tried contacting them on his CB radio, cycling through all the standard channels, but received no response despite their obvious professional operation. As the convoy passed his position, Tank got a clear view of the lead truck and felt his blood run cold. The driver appeared to be wearing military fatigues identical to the uniform Tank had worn during his service, complete with sergeant stripes and unit patches he recognized from his own deployment. More disturbing was the driver's face, which looked exactly like Tank's own appearance from 15 years earlier, down to the same haircut and facial structure he'd maintained during his Army years. The driver made direct eye contact with Tank through the passenger window and offered a crisp military salute before returning his attention to the road ahead. Tank accelerated to match the convoy's speed, positioning himself alongside the second truck to get a better look at its driver. To his horror, this driver also appeared to be himself, but wearing the uniform from a different period of his military service. The third truck's driver looked like Tank during his deployment to Afghanistan, complete with the desert camouflage and equipment he'd carried during that tour. Each successive truck in the convoy was operated by what appeared to be Tank himself at different stages of his military career, creating a rolling timeline of his past that defied all logic and reason. The convoy maintained its formation for nearly 30 miles, with Tank driving parallel to them in a state of increasing panic and confusion. He tried photographing the trucks with his cell phone, but every image came out completely black despite the clear visibility of the vehicles to his naked eye. His GPS system began malfunctioning, showing his location as coordinates that placed him in various combat zones from his military service rather than his actual position on Interstate 70. The convoy's CB radio finally crackled to life, but instead of normal trucker conversation, Tank heard his own voice conducting military communications from operations he'd participated in years earlier. Around 3:15, the convoy began signaling for an exit that Tank knew didn't exist on this stretch of highway. He'd driven this route dozens of times and was certain there were no off-ramps for the next 20 miles. But as the convoy approached their signal point, an exit materialized from the darkness complete with standard highway signs and reflective markers. The exit ramp led to what appeared to be a military checkpoint, with guard towers and perimeter fencing that stretched beyond the reach of Tank's headlights. Armed sentries in full combat gear waved the convoy through the checkpoint, but when Tank attempted to follow, the guards raised their weapons and activated spotlights that temporarily blinded him. When Tank's vision cleared, the exit had vanished completely, leaving only the familiar Illinois farmland and the standard highway configuration he'd expected to find. The convoy had disappeared without a trace, and his GPS system returned to normal operation, showing his correct location. Tank pulled over at the next rest area to collect himself and review what had just happened, but found that his logbook contained entries he didn't remember making. Written in his own handwriting were detailed descriptions of convoy movements, military grid coordinates, and tactical communications that belonged to operations from his Army service, not civilian trucking activities. Tank contacted his dispatcher to report the incident, but when he described the convoy and the mysterious exit, he was informed that traffic cameras along that stretch of Interstate 70 showed only his truck traveling alone for the entire duration of the encounter. Highway patrol records indicated no other commercial vehicles in the area during the time frame in question, and the Illinois Department of Transportation confirmed that no new exits or construction had occurred on that route in over a decade. Tank's own dash camera, which he'd been running continuously throughout the night, showed only empty highway ahead of his truck with no signs of other vehicles. The psychological impact of the encounter began affecting Tank's ability to drive effectively. He started experiencing flashbacks to his military service during routine hauls, often finding himself conducting radio checks using military protocols instead of standard trucking communications. His sleep became disrupted by dreams about convoy operations and military checkpoints that seemed more real than his actual memories. Tank began requesting only daytime routes, refusing any assignments that would require him to drive overnight through Illinois or Missouri, but the convoy encounters continued sporadically regardless of his schedule or location. Over the following months, Tank documented 6 additional encounters with variations of the same convoy, always featuring drivers who appeared to be himself at different periods of his life. The trucks began appearing not just from his military service, but from his childhood, his teenage years, and even potential future versions of himself that he didn't recognize but somehow knew to be authentic. Each encounter lasted longer and became more interactive, with the convoy drivers attempting to communicate with him through increasingly complex methods. Tank started receiving mail at truck stops addressed to military units he'd served with, containing orders for convoy operations that had never been declassified. Tank's attempts to investigate the phenomenon led him to other military veterans who had transitioned to trucking, several of whom reported similar encounters with convoys featuring multiple versions of themselves. These drivers described the same black trucks, identical formations, and mysterious exits that led to military installations that shouldn't exist. A pattern emerged, suggesting that the encounters were somehow connected to unresolved psychological trauma from military service, but the physical evidence and witness accounts indicated something far more complex than simple hallucinations or PTSD episodes. The most disturbing encounter occurred in September 2022, when Tank found himself part of the convoy rather than observing it from outside. He lost consciousness while driving through Iowa and awakened to find his truck painted the same absorbing black as the others, traveling in perfect formation with 6 other versions of himself. The convoy was transporting cargo he didn't recognize to a destination that existed only in classified military documents from operations he'd never participated in. Tank remained conscious throughout this experience, able to communicate with the other drivers through methods that transcended normal radio communications, accessing memories and knowledge that belonged to alternate versions of his own life. When Tank regained full awareness, he was parked at a truck stop in Missouri with no memory of how he'd arrived there. His truck had returned to its normal colors and configuration, but his cargo manifest showed a completed delivery to a military installation that officially didn't exist. The delivery payment appeared in his account from a Pentagon contractor that had no record of hiring civilian drivers, and Tank received a commendation letter signed by officers from his old unit who had died in combat years before he encountered the convoy. Tank retired from trucking in December 2022, but the convoy encounters didn't stop. He now works as a security guard at a small airport in Nebraska, but still receives military correspondence and deployment orders for operations involving convoy protection in theaters of conflict that exist only in classified documents. Other drivers report seeing a black truck matching Tank's description traveling alone on highways throughout the Midwest, always moving at exactly 75 miles per hour and never responding to CB radio contact. Tank maintains that these sightings represent another version of himself, one that chose to join the convoy permanently rather than return to civilian life. The military has no official position on convoy encounters reported by veteran drivers, but internal documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests reference a classified program involving temporal displacement experiments conducted on transportation personnel during the early 2000s. These experiments were allegedly designed to improve convoy security by allowing military planners to observe potential outcomes of tactical decisions before implementation. Tank's service records contain references to participation in experimental programs that he doesn't remember, including psychological evaluations and medical procedures that occurred during periods he recalls being on routine assignments. Whether the convoy represents residual effects from these experiments, manifestations of unresolved military trauma, or something far more disturbing remains an open question that has implications for hundreds of military veterans now working in the civilian transportation industry. Story 4. The Listeners in the Static. Janet Morrison had been driving cross-country routes for 12 years, building a reputation as one of the most reliable independent operators in the industry. At 38, she owned her own rig and specialized in expedited freight services, often handling time-sensitive cargo that required non-stop driving across multiple states. Janet was known for her exceptional ability to stay alert during long hauls, maintaining perfect safety records even on routes that challenged more experienced drivers. Her secret was an extensive collection of audiobooks, podcasts, and music that kept her mind engaged during the monotonous stretches of highway that could lull drivers into dangerous complacency. Janet treated her truck's sound system like a lifeline, carefully curating playlists and shows that would sustain her attention through the darkest hours of night driving. On August 14, 2020, Janet was transporting pharmaceutical supplies from Portland, Oregon to Atlanta, Georgia, a cross-country haul that would require her to drive nearly non-stop for 4 days. The cargo was time-sensitive medication for a hospital system dealing with COVID-19 patients, making delays unacceptable despite the challenging logistics of such an extended journey. Janet had planned her route meticulously, identifying rest stops, fuel stations, and the precise timing needed to comply with federal driving regulations while maintaining the delivery schedule. Her truck was equipped with the latest communication and entertainment systems, including satellite radio, cellular internet, and a premium sound system that had never failed her during thousands of miles of operation. The first sign of trouble emerged during her second night on the road, somewhere in the vast emptiness of eastern Montana. Janet was listening to a true crime podcast about unsolved disappearances when her satellite radio began experiencing interference that seemed to follow no recognizable pattern. The static wasn't the typical white noise of signal loss. Instead, it contained what sounded like fragments of conversations, music from different eras, and occasionally what appeared to be radio broadcasts from decades past. Janet initially attributed the interference to atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction, but when she switched to different audio sources, the same strange static contaminated every channel and input on her system. As the interference intensified, Janet began distinguishing actual voices within the static, speaking in languages she didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. The conversations seemed to be occurring in real time rather than being recorded broadcasts, with speakers responding to each other and discussing topics that appeared contemporary despite the antiquated quality of their transmission. Most disturbing was her growing realization that some of the voices were discussing her specifically, mentioning her name, her route, and details about her cargo that should have been confidential information. When she tried turning off her radio system completely, the voices continued emanating from her speakers even with all power sources disconnected. Janet pulled over at a truck stop near Billings to investigate her equipment, but found that all her audio systems were functioning perfectly according to their diagnostic tests. Other drivers at the facility reported no unusual radio interference, and when Janet played recordings she'd made of the strange transmissions on her phone, they contained only normal static without any of the voices or conversations she was hearing continuously. A mechanic at the truck stop examined her entire electrical system and found no malfunctions or unauthorized modifications that could explain the phenomenon. When Janet returned to her cab and started her engine, the voices resumed immediately, now discussing her stop at the truck stop and the conversations she'd had with other people there. The voices began exhibiting knowledge that extended far beyond what could be explained by simple surveillance or information gathering. They knew details about Janet's childhood, her failed marriage, her financial struggles, and her deepest fears about driving alone through remote areas. More unnervingly, they started providing information about road conditions, weather patterns, and traffic situations that proved to be completely accurate despite coming from sources that shouldn't exist. When the voices warned her about a multi-vehicle accident 30 miles ahead on Interstate 90, Janet initially ignored the advice, but ultimately decided to take an alternate route that added 2 hours to her journey. She later learned that a fatal collision had indeed occurred exactly where and when the voices had predicted. As Janet continued westward, the voices became more interactive, directly addressing her questions and engaging in conversations that felt increasingly natural despite their impossible origin. They claimed to be other truck drivers who had disappeared over the decades, trapped in some form of liminal communication space that existed between radio frequencies. Each voice had a distinct personality and history, sharing stories about routes they'd driven, loads they'd hauled, and families they'd left behind. Janet found herself looking forward to these conversations, which provided companionship during the loneliest stretches of her journey, even as she recognized the profound abnormality of her situation. The voices introduced themselves with names and backgrounds that Janet began researching during her mandatory rest breaks. Robert Chen claimed to have been driving for 30 years before vanishing on Interstate 80 in Wyoming during 1987. Maria Santos described hauling produce across the Southwest before her truck was found abandoned in New Mexico in 1994, with no trace of what had happened to her. William Tucker spoke about his family trucking business and his disappearance during a winter storm in Colorado in 2003. Every missing driver Janet researched proved to be real people whose cases remained unsolved, with official reports matching the personal details and circumstances the voices shared about their final journeys. By her third day on the road, Janet had compiled a list of over 20 missing truck drivers whose voices she'd encountered through her radio system. The conversations revealed disturbing patterns in their disappearances, including shared routes, similar cargo types, and consistent references to being called or summoned to specific locations where they'd encountered something that prevented them from continuing their journeys. Several voices described approaching areas of highway that seemed to exist outside normal geography, with exits and landmarks that appeared only under specific conditions or during particular times of night. These locations served as collection points where drivers became trapped in the static between radio frequencies, maintaining consciousness but unable to return to physical reality. Janet's growing connection with the voices began affecting her perception of reality in ways that extended beyond simple audio hallucinations. She started seeing trucks in her mirrors that didn't exist when she looked directly at them, and her GPS system occasionally showed routes through areas of highway that weren't represented on any official maps. The voices guided her through these alternate routes, which consistently proved to be faster and more efficient than conventional navigation, but led through landscapes that seemed subtly wrong despite appearing normal at first glance. Janet found herself anticipating turns and road conditions before her instruments indicated them, as if she was accessing information from sources beyond her immediate senses. The pharmaceutical cargo Janet was transporting began exhibiting unusual properties during the fourth day of her journey. Temperature sensors in her trailer showed readings that fluctuated in patterns that matched the rhythm and intensity of the radio voices, and her cargo manifest displayed information about medications that didn't match what she'd loaded in Portland. When she contacted the receiving hospital in Atlanta to confirm delivery details, they reported no record of expecting a pharmaceutical shipment and suggested she might have incorrect information about her destination. Janet's dispatcher insisted she was carrying the correct cargo to the proper location, but couldn't provide documentation that matched what Janet was observing in her trailer. As Janet approached Atlanta during the early morning hours of her fifth day on the road, the voices began preparing her for what they described as a transition point, where she would need to make a choice about continuing her journey. They explained that certain drivers, particularly those who demonstrated strong connections to the static frequencies, were offered opportunities to join their community permanently rather than completing conventional deliveries. The transition involved driving to specific coordinates that existed only during precise atmospheric conditions, where the boundary between normal highway travel and the alternate space occupied by missing drivers became permeable. Janet arrived at the Atlanta delivery location to find a hospital that matched the address in her documentation, but the facility's staff had no knowledge of her pharmaceutical shipment. Her trailer, when opened by receiving personnel, contained medical equipment that hadn't been part of her original cargo manifest, but was exactly what the hospital needed for their COVID-19 response efforts. The delivery was accepted and processed despite the documentation discrepancies, and Janet received payment for a successful completion despite the obvious impossibility of the situation. Her logbook showed a normal cross-country delivery with standard fuel stops and rest breaks, containing no references to the radio voices or alternate routes she'd experienced. Janet returned to Portland to discover that her dispatching company had no record of assigning her the Atlanta pharmaceutical delivery. The trucking firm that had originally contracted her services claimed to have canceled the shipment due to changes in hospital requirements, and the pharmaceutical manufacturer insisted their medications had been delivered through their regular distribution channels without involving independent contractors. Janet's bank account showed payment for the delivery from a company that appeared to have no legal existence, and her fuel receipts included charges from truck stops located in areas where she'd never actually stopped, according to official GPS tracking data. The voices in Janet's radio system disappeared completely after she returned to Portland, but their absence created a profound sense of isolation that made normal driving assignments almost unbearable. Janet found herself seeking out routes through remote areas where radio interference was more likely, hoping to reestablish contact with the missing drivers who had provided companionship during her most challenging haul. She began researching disappearances of truck drivers more systematically, discovering patterns and commonalities that suggested organized efforts to recruit specific individuals into whatever community existed within the radio static. Janet's subsequent driving assignments became increasingly erratic, as she prioritized routes that might lead her back to the transition points mentioned by the voices. 6 months after her Atlanta delivery, Janet's own truck was found abandoned on Interstate 15 in Nevada, with her personal belongings intact but no sign of where she had gone. Her logbook contained entries describing conversations with voices in her radio system and references to coordinates that led to locations not represented on standard maps. Other independent drivers began reporting encounters with a female voice in radio static who identified herself as Janet Morrison and provided warnings about road conditions with supernatural accuracy. These encounters followed the same patterns Janet had experienced, suggesting that the community of missing drivers continued expanding with carefully selected recruits who demonstrated the psychological and technical compatibility necessary for existence within radio frequencies. Whether Janet chose to join this community voluntarily or was compelled by forces beyond her control remains unknown, but her voice now contributes to the static that guides other drivers toward the same impossible choice between conventional reality and permanent residence in the spaces between radio waves. Story 5. The Mirror Route. Daniel, Roadrunner. Foster had been driving the same route between Phoenix and Denver for 18 months, hauling construction materials for a company that specialized in high-end commercial projects. At 29, he was relatively new to long-haul trucking, but had quickly developed a reputation for reliability and attention to detail that earned him regular assignments on this lucrative corridor. Daniel preferred consistency over variety, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of the same truck stops, the same stretches of highway, and the same timing that allowed him to maintain a predictable schedule while maximizing his earnings. His girlfriend, Lisa, often joked that he could drive the Phoenix-Denver route blindfolded, and Daniel took pride in knowing every mile marker, rest area, and potential hazard between the two cities. The route Daniel drove religiously followed Interstate 25 north through New Mexico and into Colorado, a journey that typically took 14 hours with mandatory rest breaks. He knew exactly where to fuel up for the best prices, which truck stops had the cleanest facilities, and which sections of highway were most likely to have construction delays or weather-related slowdowns. Daniel had driven this route over 100 times without significant incident, developing what he considered an intimate familiarity with every curve, grade, and landmark along the way. His detailed knowledge of the route had helped him assist other drivers with navigation advice and had even enabled him to guide emergency responders to accident locations with pinpoint accuracy. On June 3, 2023, Daniel began what he expected to be a routine Phoenix-Denver run, hauling steel beams for a downtown office complex under construction. The weather forecast was favorable, with clear skies and moderate temperatures throughout the southwest, and his load was well balanced and properly secured according to all safety regulations. Daniel left Phoenix at 4:30 in the morning, right on schedule, planning to arrive in Denver by early evening with time to spare before his delivery appointment. Everything about the journey felt completely normal as he navigated through familiar Arizona terrain and crossed into New Mexico, following the exact same route he'd traveled dozens of times before. Around noon, approximately 8 hours into his journey, Daniel noticed something that made him question his own perception. The landscape outside his windows looked exactly as he expected, but the mile markers he was passing indicated he was 50 miles further north than his odometer and GPS system suggested. When he checked his position on multiple navigation devices, they all confirmed his expected location based on time and distance traveled, but the highway signs and geographical landmarks clearly indicated he was much further along his route than should have been possible. Daniel initially attributed the discrepancy to equipment malfunction, but when he called his dispatcher for a position check, their GPS tracking system showed him in the correct location according to his instruments rather than the mile markers he was observing. The confusion deepened when Daniel reached what should have been his usual fuel stop in Albuquerque, only to discover that the truck stop he'd visited regularly for over a year had been replaced by a facility he'd never seen before. The new truck stop occupied the same location and had the same basic layout, but everything from the building design to the staff members was completely different. When Daniel asked about the previous facility, the employees insisted it had always been configured exactly as he was seeing it, and showed him photographs dating back decades that supported their claims. Daniel's fuel receipts from previous trips clearly showed purchases at a different establishment, but the credit card records at this location indicated he'd been a regular customer for years using the same payment methods. Daniel decided to continue his journey despite the growing inconsistencies, but found that every familiar landmark along his route had been subtly altered in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Rest areas he'd used countless times had different restroom configurations, different parking layouts, and different vendor machines, despite occupying the exact same geographical locations. Road construction projects he'd navigated around for months were in different stages of completion, and some highways he remembered as recently repaved now showed years of wear and weathering. Most disturbing was his realization that other drivers he encountered seemed to recognize him and reference previous conversations he had no memory of having. The psychological impact of these discrepancies began affecting Daniel's ability to drive confidently on a route he'd previously considered as familiar as his own neighborhood. He started second-guessing every turn, every exit, and every navigation decision, despite following the same interstate highway he'd traveled successfully over 100 times. Daniel's CB radio conversations with other drivers revealed that they had completely different memories of road conditions, recent accidents, and construction projects than what he remembered from his previous trips. When he tried explaining the inconsistencies to fellow truckers, they suggested he might be thinking of a different route or confusing details from multiple journeys. As Daniel approached Denver during the late afternoon, the discrepancies became impossible to ignore or rationalize. The city skyline appeared different from what he remembered, with buildings in different locations and construction projects that didn't match his recent observations. The delivery address he'd been given led to a construction site that was in a completely different stage of development than what he'd expected based on his previous deliveries to the same project. The construction foreman who received his steel beam delivery thanked him for his consistent service over the past 3 years, despite Daniel's certainty that he'd only been driving this route for 18 months. Daniel's delivery documentation showed completed trips to the same construction site dating back over 3 years, with his own signature on receipts and his truck's identification numbers on shipping records. The construction company's files contained detailed records of his punctuality, professionalism, and reliability over an extended period that exceeded his entire trucking career. When Daniel contacted his dispatching company to clarify his employment history, they confirmed that he'd been driving the Phoenix-Denver route for 3 years and expressed concern about his apparent memory issues. Daniel's own logbooks, which he'd maintained meticulously throughout his trucking career, now contained entries spanning 3 years instead of 18 months. The return trip to Phoenix became a nightmare of cognitive dissonance as Daniel encountered more evidence that contradicted his memories of his own life and career. Truck stop employees greeted him as a longtime, regular customer, showing him loyalty program benefits and purchase histories that spanned years. His fuel card statements revealed thousands of dollars in transactions at locations he was certain he'd never visited, and his maintenance records showed routine service appointments at shops he didn't remember using. Fellow truckers he met along the route referenced conversations, shared meals, and mutual assistance dating back years, describing events that felt completely foreign to Daniel despite their obvious familiarity with him. Daniel's girlfriend, Lisa, became increasingly concerned when he returned to Phoenix in a state of confusion and distress, insisting that his memories of their relationship were somehow wrong. According to Lisa, they'd been together for over 3 years, and she had detailed photographs, text message histories, and shared experiences that documented their relationship far beyond the timeline Daniel remembered. Lisa showed him evidence that he'd been driving trucks professionally for 5 years, not the 2 years he distinctly recalled, and had owned his current rig for 3 years rather than the 18 months he believed. When Daniel examined his truck's maintenance records and registration documents, they confirmed Lisa's timeline rather than his own memories. The most disturbing revelation occurred when Daniel discovered that he'd been making the same Phoenix-Denver route not weekly as he believed, but daily for the past 3 years. His logbooks showed a continuous cycle of same-day round trips that would have been physically impossible under federal driving regulations, yet somehow he'd been completing them consistently while maintaining perfect safety records and on-time delivery performance. The construction company in Denver had been receiving daily steel beam deliveries from Daniel's truck for years, with each load apparently being used immediately in a construction project that never seemed to progress beyond the same stage of development, despite continuous material deliveries. Daniel attempted to break the cycle by accepting assignments to different destinations, but found that regardless of where his dispatcher claimed to be sending him, he always ended up on the familiar Phoenix-Denver route carrying steel beams to the same construction site. His GPS systems, shipping manifests, and delivery documentation all confirmed that he was traveling to various locations across the Southwest, but his actual physical journey invariably followed the same interstate highways to the same destination with the same cargo. Other drivers reported seeing Daniel's truck on routes throughout the region, but Daniel himself experienced only the repetitive loop between Phoenix and Denver that had somehow expanded to consume his entire existence. Daniel's attempts to research his own employment history led to the discovery that multiple versions of his life existed simultaneously in various record-keeping systems. Some databases showed him as a new driver with 18 months of experience. Others indicated he was a seasoned professional with decades of highway miles, and still others suggested he'd been making the same route continuously since the early 2000s. Daniel's Social Security records, tax filings, and employment documentation contained contradictory information about his work history, with some records suggesting he'd never worked in any industry other than trucking, despite his clear memories of previous careers in construction and retail management. The construction site in Denver that received Daniel's daily deliveries existed in a state of perpetual near completion, with the same workers performing the same tasks every day using steel beams that seemed to disappear overnight only to require replacement the following day. Daniel began documenting the construction progress with photographs and videos, but found that his recordings showed different stages of development each time he reviewed them, as if the project existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. The construction foreman who signed for Daniel's deliveries appeared to be the same person every day, but showed no recognition of previous conversations and repeated identical interactions as if meeting Daniel for the first time during each delivery. Daniel's current status remains unknown, as he continues making daily round trips between Phoenix and Denver in a route that exists outside normal temporal and geographical constraints. Other truckers report encountering Daniel's truck on highways throughout the Southwest, where he appears to be driving normally and responds to CB radio communications about routine trucking matters. However, Daniel himself experiences only the endless repetition of the same 14-hour journey, delivering steel beams to a construction project that never progresses and returning to Phoenix to begin the cycle again. Lisa receives daily phone calls from Daniel describing his Phoenix-Denver runs, but their conversations follow identical patterns regardless of external events or calendar dates. Whether Daniel is trapped in some form of temporal loop, experiencing a psychological breakdown, or has become part of a phenomenon that transcends normal reality remains unexplained, but his truck continues appearing on southwestern highways carrying steel beams to destinations that may exist only in the spaces between familiar routes and forgotten time. Story 6. The Sleeper's Highway. Vincent Nighthawk. Castellanos had built his entire trucking career around conquering insomnia, turning his inability to sleep into a competitive advantage that made him one of the most sought-after drivers for coast-to-coast emergency freight. At 45, Vincent could drive for 20-hour stretches with a level of alertness that amazed dispatchers and concerned safety inspectors, maintaining perfect reaction times and decision-making abilities during hours when most drivers would be dangerously impaired. His secret wasn't stimulants or caffeine addiction, but a genuine neurological condition called delayed sleep phase syndrome that kept him naturally alert during nighttime hours when his body should have been demanding rest. Vincent had learned to manage his condition through careful scheduling and strategic power naps, creating a sustainable driving pattern that allowed him to handle the most challenging long-haul assignments. For over 15 years, Vincent had specialized in what the industry called vampire runs, hauling time-sensitive cargo during overnight hours when highways were less congested and delivery windows were most critical. His reputation for completing impossible deadlines had earned him premium rates and exclusive contracts with companies that needed absolutely reliable overnight transportation. Vincent took pride in his ability to remain sharp and focused during the dangerous hours between midnight and dawn when most accidents occurred, and his safety record reflected his mastery of night driving conditions. He knew every truck stop that stayed open 24 hours, every stretch of highway where drowsy drivers posed hazards, and every technique for maintaining alertness during the monotonous periods that lulled other truckers into microsleep episodes. On September 7, 2021, Vincent accepted what appeared to be a routine emergency delivery from Seattle to Miami, transporting medical equipment that needed to arrive within 72 hours to support a hospital's new cardiac surgery program. The cargo was high value but not particularly sensitive, and the route allowed for standard rest breaks and fuel stops without compromising the delivery schedule. Vincent planned to drive continuously for the first 20 hours, reaching Texas before taking his first substantial rest period, then completing the journey with a final 16-hour push to Miami. The weather forecast showed clear conditions across most of the country, and Vincent felt confident about maintaining his usual high-speed, high-alertness driving performance throughout the assignment. The first indication that something was wrong came during Vincent's second night on the road, somewhere in the vast emptiness of West Texas on Interstate 10. Despite feeling completely alert and maintaining his normal driving speed, Vincent noticed that his progress according to GPS systems and mile markers was significantly slower than what his speedometer and elapsed time indicated. After driving for what felt like 6 hours at a steady 70 miles per hour, Vincent had covered only about half the distance he should have traveled according to his navigation systems. His truck's performance seemed normal, with engine temperature, fuel consumption, and all mechanical systems operating within standard parameters, but something was causing a disconnect between his perception of time and his actual progress along the highway. Vincent initially attributed the discrepancy to equipment malfunction or GPS satellite issues, but when he contacted other drivers in the area, they reported normal travel times and accurate positioning systems. His dispatcher confirmed that the truck's fleet tracking showed Vincent making steady progress at normal speeds, contradicting his own experience of covering less ground than expected. Vincent tried adjusting his speed and monitoring his instruments more carefully, but the temporal distortion seemed to intensify rather than resolve. Hours that felt like normal driving time on his biological clock corresponded to much longer periods according to his dashboard clock and external time references. As Vincent continued eastward, the temporal distortion began affecting more than just his travel speed. His mandatory rest breaks, which he timed precisely according to federal regulations, seemed to stretch far longer than the required periods despite his internal sense of time passing normally. When Vincent stopped for what should have been a 30-minute inspection break, he emerged from his truck to discover that several hours had passed according to external clocks, though he had no memory of additional time and felt fully rested rather than groggy from oversleeping. Other drivers at rest stops commented on seeing Vincent's truck parked for extended periods, but Vincent experienced only brief, normal break durations. The medical equipment Vincent was transporting began exhibiting unusual properties that seemed connected to the temporal distortions he was experiencing. Temperature-sensitive components that should have required continuous climate control maintained perfect conditions despite his truck's system showing extended periods of power interruption. The cargo manifest changed subtly during his journey, listing equipment models that hadn't existed when he loaded the shipment in Seattle, and the delivery address in Miami led to a hospital wing that was still under construction according to his research but supposedly needed the equipment immediately upon arrival. Vincent's attempts to contact his dispatcher became increasingly difficult, as the temporal distortions affected his communication equipment in ways that suggested the disruption extended beyond simple time perception. Phone calls that lasted minutes on his end apparently continued for hours from the perspective of people he was speaking with, during which Vincent seemed to provide detailed information about road conditions and delivery progress that he had no memory of discussing. His CB radio conversations with other truckers revealed that he was apparently broadcasting continuous updates about his journey, describing rest stops, fuel purchases, and route changes that didn't match his conscious experience of the trip. During his third night on the road, while crossing Louisiana on Interstate 10, Vincent encountered other drivers who appeared to be experiencing similar temporal distortions but seemed unaware of their condition. These drivers maintained normal conversations about routine trucking matters, but their trucks were traveling at impossibly slow speeds, while their occupants behaved as if making normal progress. Vincent could observe these trucks moving at perhaps 10 miles per hour, while their drivers operated as if cruising at highway speeds, checking mirrors, adjusting radios, and conducting themselves exactly like drivers covering normal distances in expected time frames. Vincent realized that he might be experiencing the same phenomenon when he checked his fuel consumption and discovered that he'd used far more diesel than his distance traveled should have required, as if his truck had been running continuously for days longer than his conscious experience of the journey. His logbook entries, which he maintained meticulously according to federal regulations, showed extended periods of driving time that exceeded what should have been physically possible under hours of service rules, yet he felt no fatigue or strain from the allegedly excessive driving periods. Vincent's electronic logging device showed compliant rest periods and legal driving hours, but his fuel receipts and mileage records suggested a journey lasting far longer than what either logging system indicated. The medical equipment delivery in Miami became the most disturbing aspect of Vincent's entire experience. When he arrived at the hospital address, the cardiac surgery wing that supposedly needed immediate equipment installation had been operational for over 2 years, with the same medical devices Vincent was delivering already installed and functioning normally. Hospital personnel insisted they had no record of ordering replacement equipment, but Vincent's delivery documentation showed a routine maintenance exchange that the hospital's own records confirmed as completed on schedule. The equipment Vincent had transported from Seattle was identical to devices that had apparently never left the hospital, creating an impossible duplication that neither shipping nor receiving parties could explain. Vincent's return journey to Seattle followed the same temporal distortions in reverse, with distances seeming to stretch endlessly while time compressed into periods that felt much shorter than external clocks indicated. His fuel consumption patterns suggested he'd driven continuously for weeks, but his biological rhythms and fatigue levels corresponded to a normal 3-day cross-country trip. Vincent's sleep patterns, which had been stable throughout his 15-year career, became completely disrupted as his internal clock lost synchronization with external time references, leaving him unable to predict when he would feel alert or drowsy. The psychological impact of the temporal distortions began affecting Vincent's ability to maintain the precise scheduling and timing that had made his career successful. He started accepting only local deliveries within single time zones, hoping to avoid the geographical triggers that seemed to activate whatever phenomenon was distorting his perception of time and distance. Vincent's dispatcher noted significant changes in his driving patterns and delivery performance, with routes that should have taken specific durations requiring unpredictably longer or shorter time frames that made scheduling subsequent assignments nearly impossible. Vincent's medical evaluations revealed no neurological changes that could explain his temporal perception problems, and sleep studies showed that his delayed sleep phase syndrome remained stable and unchanged from previous examinations. However, his GPS tracking data revealed patterns suggesting that his truck sometimes covered distances that weren't represented on any standard maps, following routes that existed only during specific atmospheric or temporal conditions. These alternate routes appeared to connect the same origin and destination points, but traversed geographical spaces that defied conventional understanding of highway infrastructure and interstate connectivity. 6 months after his Seattle-Miami delivery, Vincent retired from long-haul trucking and took a position driving local delivery routes that never required overnight travel or extended highway driving. However, he continues experiencing temporal distortions during routine activities, finding that trips to grocery stores or appointments sometimes require hours longer than expected while feeling like normal duration experiences. Vincent's former colleagues report occasionally seeing his truck on long-haul routes despite his retirement, traveling at normal speeds but somehow covering impossible distances in time frames that suggest movement through spaces that exist parallel to conventional highways. Vincent now works as a driving instructor at a commercial trucking school, teaching new drivers about fatigue management and the importance of maintaining accurate time awareness during long-distance hauling. His students notice that Vincent's instruction sessions sometimes last much longer or shorter than scheduled despite covering the planned curriculum completely, and several have reported experiencing their own temporal perception distortions after practicing night driving techniques under Vincent's guidance. Whether Vincent's condition represents a unique neurological adaptation to extreme driving demands, exposure to phenomena that exist in the spaces between time zones, or something far more complex remains unexplored by medical professionals who have no framework for understanding temporal distortions that affect physical reality rather than simple perception. The highway between Seattle and Miami continues to be traveled by thousands of drivers annually, but a small percentage report temporal distortions similar to Vincent's experience, particularly during overnight hours when normal circadian rhythms are most vulnerable to disruption. These reports consistently involve drivers with exceptional night driving abilities and histories of managing extreme long-haul schedules, suggesting that certain individuals may be more susceptible to whatever forces cause time and distance to become disconnected from conventional physical laws along specific interstate corridors. Story 7. The Passenger Manifest. Carlos Freight Train. Mendoza had been driving specialized passenger transport for charter bus and luxury coach companies for 23 years before transitioning to freight hauling in 2019. At 51, he brought an unusual background to trucking, having spent over 2 decades managing passenger safety, comfort, and logistics for tour groups, corporate events, and long-distance charter services. Carlos was known for his exceptional people skills and his ability to handle difficult passengers with patience and professionalism, qualities that seemed irrelevant to freight transportation but had earned him respect throughout the passenger transport industry. His transition to trucking was motivated by a desire for solitude and simplicity after decades of managing demanding customers and complex group dynamics. Carlos specialized in hauling retail merchandise and consumer goods along the I-35 corridor between Dallas and Minneapolis, a route that kept him busy with steady freight volume while allowing him to maintain a predictable schedule. His truck was a standard 48-foot dry van with no special equipment or modifications, configured exactly like thousands of other freight haulers operating throughout the Midwest. Carlos preferred this anonymity and routine, finding peace in the straightforward nature of moving cargo from point A to point B without the interpersonal complications that had defined his passenger transport career. He maintained his commercial driver's license with passenger endorsements, but had no intention of ever returning to the bus industry. On January 15, 2022, Carlos was hauling a load of furniture and home goods from Dallas to Minneapolis when he began hearing voices from his empty trailer during a routine fuel stop in Oklahoma City. The sounds were faint but distinctly human, resembling conversations between multiple people discussing travel plans, weather conditions, and arrival times. Carlos initially assumed the voices were coming from other trucks or travelers in the truck stop, but when he walked around his rig to investigate, he determined that the sounds were definitely emanating from inside his sealed trailer. Since his cargo consisted entirely of boxed furniture and household items, there should have been no source for human voices within the trailer's interior. Carlos opened his trailer to investigate and found his cargo exactly as he'd loaded it in Dallas, with no signs of tampering or unauthorized access. The furniture boxes were properly secured and showed no evidence of damage or disturbance, yet the voices continued throughout his inspection, now seeming to come from different locations within the trailer, as if people were moving around among the cargo. The conversations he overheard were typical passenger chatter, discussing destinations, comfort levels, and concerns about arrival schedules. Exactly the kind of dialogue Carlos had listened to for over 2 decades while driving charter buses. The voices referred to their current location as if they were passengers on a scheduled transport service rather than stowaways in a freight trailer. As Carlos resumed his journey north on Interstate 35, the voices in his trailer became more distinct and interactive, responding to changes in his driving speed, route selections, and stops for fuel or rest breaks. When Carlos accelerated, passengers expressed concern about the increased speed and asked him to drive more carefully. When he took exits for fuel stops, they thanked him for the break and discussed stretching their legs, despite no one actually exiting or boarding the trailer. The voices demonstrated detailed knowledge of the route between Dallas and Minneapolis, commenting on landmarks, discussing previous trips, and sharing familiarity with specific truck stops and rest areas along the way. Carlos attempted to rationalize the voices as radio interference, auditory hallucinations from fatigue, or some form of acoustic phenomenon related to his cargo shifting during transport. However, when he tried communicating with the voices directly through his trailer's interior communication system, which he'd never installed, they responded appropriately and engaged in normal passenger-driver conversations about travel conditions, estimated arrival times, and route preferences. The passengers seemed to believe they had purchased tickets for charter bus service from Dallas to Minneapolis and expected Carlos to provide the same level of service and communication he'd offered during his bus driving career. The phenomenon intensified as Carlos crossed into Kansas, where the voices began requesting specific services and accommodations that were standard features of passenger transport but impossible to provide in a freight trailer. Passengers asked about restroom facilities, requested temperature adjustments, and complained about the lack of reading lights and comfortable seating. Carlos found himself automatically responding with the professional courtesy and problem-solving approaches he'd developed during his bus driving years, apologizing for the limited amenities and promising to address their concerns at the next scheduled stop, despite the obvious absurdity of providing passenger services to voices in an empty trailer. Carlos's CB radio began receiving communications that appeared to be related to passenger transport dispatch rather than freight coordination. He received updates about passenger pickup schedules, route modifications based on traffic conditions, and instructions for handling special needs passengers that had no connection to his current freight assignment. When Carlos tried contacting his dispatcher to clarify his load information, he discovered that his assignment had somehow changed from furniture transport to passenger service, with documentation showing he was operating a charter bus rather than a freight truck despite clearly driving his familiar 18-wheeler configuration. During an overnight rest stop in Kansas City, Carlos experienced the most disturbing escalation of the phenomenon when he observed passengers boarding and exiting his trailer despite the physical impossibility of such activity. Through his mirrors, he could see people approaching his trailer, opening doors that shouldn't exist, and settling into seating arrangements that weren't part of his cargo configuration. The passengers appeared to be normal travelers carrying typical luggage and behaving exactly like charter bus customers. But when Carlos walked around his truck to observe them directly, he saw only his standard freight trailer with no signs of passenger activity. Carlos's logbook began showing entries related to passenger manifest management, recording boarding and departure times, passenger counts and service quality notes that had no connection to freight transportation. His own handwriting documented passenger interactions, special requests, and route adjustments that reflected his bus driving experience rather than his current trucking assignment. The entries appeared in his logbook automatically, without Carlos's conscious knowledge of writing them, and described passenger service scenarios that felt completely familiar despite their obvious impossibility in his current situation. The voices in Carlos's trailer began sharing personal stories and travel experiences that resonated deeply with his memories of passenger transport service. Elderly passengers discussed visiting family members. Business travelers shared concerns about meeting schedules, and vacation groups planned activities for their destinations. All conversations that Carlos had heard thousands of times during his bus driving career. The familiarity of these interactions provided a strange comfort despite their supernatural origin, reconnecting Carlos with the interpersonal aspects of transportation work that he'd missed more than he'd realized since transitioning to freight hauling. As Carlos approached Minneapolis, the passengers began preparing for arrival with the same rituals and behaviors he remembered from charter bus service. They gathered their belongings, thanked him for a safe journey, and discussed their plans after reaching their destination. The voices expressed satisfaction with the trip quality, and several mentioned intentions to request Carlos specifically for future travel needs. When Carlos reached his delivery destination in Minneapolis, he found that his furniture cargo had been replaced by passenger luggage and personal items that belonged to the voices he'd been hearing throughout the journey, despite no opportunity for such a substitution to occur. Carlos's delivery documentation showed completion of a passenger transport service rather than freight delivery, with customer satisfaction ratings and service quality evaluations that reflected his performance as a charter bus driver. The receiving party at his Minneapolis destination was a hotel coordinator expecting a group of passengers for a corporate retreat, and they expressed appreciation for Carlos's punctuality and professionalism in delivering their guests safely. Carlos's payment for the trip reflected charter bus rates rather than freight transportation, and his company records showed he'd been operating passenger service throughout his entire trucking career. The return journey to Dallas became a nightmare of identity confusion as Carlos struggled to reconcile his freight trucking reality with increasing evidence that he'd never left the passenger transport industry. His truck's configuration appeared unchanged to his perception, but other drivers and industry personnel treated him as a charter bus operator, discussing passenger service challenges and regulatory issues specific to the bus industry. Carlos's DOT records, insurance documentation, and vehicle registration all indicated passenger transport operations despite his clear memory of transitioning to freight trucking 3 years earlier. Carlos attempted to resolve the confusion by accepting only freight assignments that had no possible connection to passenger transport, but found that regardless of his cargo manifest or shipping documentation, his loads somehow transformed into passenger service scenarios during transit. Freight shipments became tour group luggage, commercial goods became passenger amenities, and delivery destinations became hotels or event venues where groups of travelers expected Carlos to provide charter bus service. His truck physically remained a freight configuration, but its function and purpose had become permanently linked to passenger transport regardless of his intentions or assignments. The psychological impact of this transformation forced Carlos to accept that some aspect of his identity was fundamentally connected to passenger service in ways that transcended physical reality or conscious career decisions. He embraced the phenomenon rather than fighting it, acknowledging the voices in his trailer as legitimate passengers who deserved the same professional service he'd provided during his official bus driving career. Carlos began planning his routes and schedules around passenger comfort and satisfaction, even though his trips appeared to outside observers as normal freight transportation between conventional shipping points. Carlos currently operates what appears to be a standard freight truck but functions as a supernatural charter bus service for passengers who exist in spaces between conventional transportation methods. His customer base consists entirely of travelers who need passage between destinations but cannot access normal bus or airline services for reasons that remain unexplained. These passengers book passage through methods that bypass standard reservation systems, pay through financial channels that exist parallel to normal commerce, and travel to destinations that may exist only during specific temporal or atmospheric conditions. Other drivers report encountering Carlos on highways throughout the Midwest, where his truck appears to be hauling normal freight but demonstrates passenger service behaviors such as making frequent comfort stops, maintaining conservative speeds, and following routes that prioritize passenger safety over delivery efficiency. Carlos responds to CB radio communications about freight transport matters, but his conversations often include references to passenger satisfaction, travel comfort, and service quality issues that suggest he's operating in multiple transportation realities simultaneously. The I-35 corridor between Dallas and Minneapolis has become known among certain communities as a reliable route for travelers who need transportation services that exist outside conventional bus lines, airlines, or passenger rail systems. These travelers somehow contact Carlos directly to arrange passage, boarding his truck at locations that appear to be normal truck stops but function as passenger terminals for individuals whose travel needs cannot be met through standard commercial transportation. Whether Carlos chose to return to passenger service voluntarily or was compelled by forces that recognized his calling as a transportation professional who truly cared about passenger welfare remains unclear, but his truck continues providing charter services to travelers whose existence challenges conventional understanding of who needs transportation and how such services can be delivered. Story 8. The Weight That Wasn't There. Patricia Heavy Haul. Sullivan specialized in oversized load transportation, hauling industrial equipment, construction machinery, and oversized components that required special permits and escort vehicles. At 36, she was one of the few women in the heavy haul industry and had built her reputation on precise load calculations, meticulous route planning, and an almost supernatural ability to sense weight distribution problems before they became dangerous. Patricia owned specialized trailer equipment worth over $300,000 and maintained contracts with manufacturers who trusted her with their most valuable and challenging cargo. Her expertise in managing loads up to 200,000 pounds had made her indispensable to clients who needed absolutely reliable transport for equipment that couldn't be replaced if damaged during shipping. Patricia's truck was equipped with advanced weight monitoring systems, air suspension controls, and computerized load distribution analyzers that provided real-time feedback about every aspect of her cargo's behavior during transport. She could feel subtle changes in her load through the truck's handling characteristics and had prevented numerous accidents by detecting shifting cargo or weight imbalances before they became catastrophic failures. Patricia took pride in her technical knowledge and her intuitive understanding of heavy load dynamics, considering herself as much an engineer as a driver when it came to managing the complex physics of oversized transportation. On April 23, 2021, Patricia accepted a contract to transport a massive industrial generator from Houston to Portland, Oregon, a piece of equipment weighing exactly 187,000 pounds according to the manufacturer's specifications. The generator was destined for a power plant expansion project and represented a critical component that couldn't be delayed without affecting the entire construction schedule. Patricia had transported similar equipment dozens of times and felt completely confident about managing the load despite the challenging route through mountainous terrain in Colorado and Utah. Her trailer configuration was perfect for the generator's dimensions and weight distribution, and she'd obtained all necessary permits for the oversized load transport. The loading process in Houston proceeded normally, with crane operators placing the generator precisely on Patricia's trailer according to predetermined weight distribution calculations. Patricia conducted her standard inspection routine, checking tie-down points, measuring load dimensions, and verifying that her trailer's weight sensors showed the expected 187,000-pound reading. Everything appeared perfect as she began her journey west on Interstate 10, with her truck's handling characteristics exactly matching what she expected for a load of that size and weight. The generator was properly secured with chains, binders, and specialized blocking that met all federal transportation safety requirements. During her first day of driving, Patricia began noticing subtle inconsistencies in her truck's performance that suggested her load was behaving differently than its documented weight should indicate. Her fuel consumption was significantly lower than expected for hauling nearly 200,000 pounds, and her engine wasn't working as hard as it should during grade climbs in East Texas and Louisiana. When Patricia checked her weight sensors during her first mandatory break, they continued showing the correct 187,000-pound reading, but her truck's suspension and handling felt more like she was pulling a load half that size. Patricia initially attributed the discrepancy to equipment calibration issues, or perhaps exceptional road conditions that were making her heavy load feel lighter than normal. However, when she stopped at a certified truck scale in Texas to verify her gross vehicle weight, the scale showed her total weight as being 60,000 pounds less than what her cargo weight plus truck weight should have indicated. Patricia repeated the weighing process 3 times with identical results, suggesting that her 187,000-pound generator somehow weighed only about 127,000 pounds when measured independently of her trailer's built-in sensors. The weight discrepancy became more pronounced as Patricia continued westward, with her truck's performance suggesting an increasingly lighter load despite her sensors continuing to show the original weight reading. Patricia was climbing steep grades in New Mexico without the engine strain and reduced speed that should have been inevitable with such a heavy load, and her braking distances were significantly shorter than safety calculations indicated they should be for her documented cargo weight. When she contacted the generator manufacturer to verify the equipment specifications, they confirmed that the unit weighed exactly 187,000 pounds and suggested that her weighing equipment might be malfunctioning. Patricia's attempts to resolve the weight mystery led to increasingly disturbing discoveries about the nature of her cargo. When she physically inspected the generator during a rest stop in Arizona, the equipment appeared identical to what she'd loaded in Houston, but her trailer's suspension system was compressed far less than it should have been under the generator's documented weight. Patricia's tie-down chains and securing equipment showed stress levels consistent with a much lighter load, despite being rated and configured for the generator's official weight specifications. Most puzzling was her observation that the generator seemed to be resting more lightly on her trailer deck than physics should have allowed. As Patricia entered California and began climbing through mountainous terrain, the weight anomaly became impossible to ignore. Her truck was ascending grades that should have required reduced speed and maximum engine power, but she was maintaining highway speeds with normal engine performance as if pulling an empty trailer. Patricia's transmission wasn't shifting down for steep climbs, her engine temperature remained normal during extended grade ascents, and her overall fuel efficiency was dramatically better than any previous experience hauling loads over 100,000 pounds. Patricia decided to conduct a comprehensive inspection of her cargo at a truck stop near Bakersfield, using every diagnostic tool and measurement technique available to determine what was happening to her generator's weight. Her trailer's built-in scales continued showing 187,000 pounds, but when she used portable scales to measure individual axle weights, the readings indicated a total load approximately 60,000 pounds lighter than expected. More disturbing was Patricia's discovery that the generator appeared to be exerting less downward pressure on her trailer deck than its volume and apparent mass should have produced. The weight mystery intensified during Patricia's final approach to Portland, where her truck's performance became completely inconsistent with hauling heavy cargo. She was traveling up steep grades in the Cascade Mountains at speeds that would have been impossible with a properly weighted load, and her braking performance on downhill sections required much less effort than safety protocols demanded for heavy haul operations. Patricia's engine wasn't working harder than normal despite pulling what appeared to be a massive industrial generator through challenging mountain terrain, and her fuel consumption remained far below expectations for heavy load transportation. Patricia arrived at the Portland power plant to deliver her generator and discovered that the receiving crew was prepared for unloading equipment weighing 187,000 pounds, bringing crane equipment and personnel appropriate for handling such a massive load. However, when the crane operators attempted to lift the generator from Patricia's trailer, they found that their equipment settings were too powerful for the actual weight they encountered. The generator lifted much more easily than expected, requiring significant adjustment to crane settings and load handling procedures to prevent damage from overcompensation for anticipated weight. The power plant's scale system showed the delivered generator weighing exactly 187,000 pounds, matching both the manufacturer's specifications and Patricia's trailer sensors, but the equipment's behavior during unloading suggested it was significantly lighter than these measurements indicated. Installation crews reported that the generator was much easier to position and maneuver than comparable equipment, and several experienced technicians commented that it seemed to weigh far less than similar units they'd handled previously. The generator's foundation requirements had been calculated for 187,000 pounds, but the actual foundation stress appeared to be much less than engineering specifications anticipated. Patricia's delivery documentation showed successful transport of a generator weighing exactly 187,000 pounds, and her payment reflected the premium rates charged for heavy-haul services. However, her fuel receipts, engine performance data, and mechanical wear patterns all indicated that she'd been hauling a load approximately 60,000 pounds lighter than documented throughout the entire journey. Patricia's truck's maintenance records showed wear consistent with lighter load operations, despite official documentation confirming heavy haul transportation services. The psychological impact of the weight discrepancy forced Patricia to question her expertise and intuitive understanding of load management that had defined her career. She began accepting only loads that could be independently verified through multiple weighing systems, but found that similar weight anomalies occurred with increasing frequency. Industrial equipment that weighed according to specifications when measured statically somehow became lighter during transportation, exhibiting performance characteristics that contradicted their documented mass while maintaining their official weight readings on certified scales. Patricia's subsequent heavy haul assignments revealed a pattern of equipment that weighed correctly when loaded and unloaded, but somehow lost substantial mass during transportation. Generators, turbines, construction equipment, and industrial machinery consistently performed as if weighing significantly less than their specifications while maintaining proper weight readings on scales and sensors. Patricia's truck began requiring less fuel, experiencing reduced mechanical stress, and achieving better performance than should have been possible when hauling officially documented heavy loads. The phenomenon affected not only Patricia's cargo, but other heavy haul operators who began reporting similar experiences with equipment that weighed properly when stationary but somehow became lighter during transport. Industry speculation suggested possible measurement errors, equipment calibration problems, or previously unknown physics related to weight distribution during motion, but no explanation could account for the consistent discrepancy between static weight measurements and dynamic transportation behavior. Patricia's reputation as a heavy haul specialist remained intact, but her understanding of weight and mass became fundamentally altered by experiences that challenged basic physical principles. Patricia currently operates her heavy haul business with the knowledge that her cargo may weigh significantly less during transport than official specifications indicate, allowing her to achieve better fuel efficiency and mechanical performance than competitors who haven't experienced similar phenomena. Her clients receive the same high-quality heavy haul services they expect, but Patricia's operations have become more efficient and cost-effective due to the mysterious weight reduction that affects her cargo during transportation. Whether this phenomenon represents a supernatural alteration of physical properties, a previously unknown aspect of heavy load dynamics, or Patricia's unique sensitivity to weight variations that other drivers don't notice remains unexplored, but her truck continues hauling officially documented heavy loads that somehow become lighter during the journey between pickup and delivery locations. Other heavy haul operators report encountering Patricia on highways throughout the western United States, where her truck appears to be hauling normal oversized equipment, but demonstrates performance characteristics that suggest much lighter loads than her permits and documentation indicate. Patricia maintains normal CB radio communications about heavy haul operations, route conditions, and industry matters, but her truck's behavior suggests she's operating in a transportation reality where weight and mass follow different rules than those governing conventional heavy haul services. Story 9. The Delivery That Delivered Itself. Eugene "Steady" Eddie. Parker had built his trucking career on absolute reliability, completing over 2,000 deliveries in 14 years without a single late arrival or damaged cargo incident. At 47, he was considered the gold standard for precision logistics, hired specifically for shipments where timing was critical and failure wasn't an option. Eugene's methodical approach to route planning, vehicle maintenance, and cargo handling had earned him exclusive contracts with companies that manufactured time-sensitive products like fresh pharmaceuticals, live biological samples, and prototype electronics that couldn't tolerate delays or mishandling. His truck was equipped with advanced GPS tracking, real-time cargo monitoring, and communication systems that allowed clients to follow their shipments minute by minute throughout the delivery process. Eugene specialized in what the industry called white-glove deliveries, handling cargo that required not just transportation but careful coordination with receiving parties, precise timing windows, and detailed documentation of chain-of-custody procedures. His clients included medical research facilities, aerospace manufacturers, and technology companies that needed absolutely guaranteed delivery performance for materials worth millions of dollars. Eugene took pride in his ability to anticipate potential problems, develop contingency plans, and maintain perfect communication with all parties involved in complex delivery scenarios. His reputation was built on the understanding that when Eugene accepted a delivery assignment, the cargo would arrive exactly when and where promised, regardless of weather, traffic, or mechanical challenges. On May 11, 2022, Eugene accepted a high-priority delivery from a biotechnology company in San Diego to a research facility in Boston, transporting what he was told were temperature-controlled medical samples that required delivery within 36 hours. The cargo consisted of a single specialized container about the size of a large briefcase, equipped with its own power supply and climate control system that maintained precise temperature and atmospheric conditions throughout transport. Eugene was provided with detailed handling instructions, emergency contact numbers, and strict protocols for maintaining the container's integrity during the cross-country journey. The shipping documentation indicated the cargo was worth over $2 million and represented months of irreplaceable research work. Eugene began his journey from San Diego at 4:30 in the morning, planning a route that would allow him to reach Boston with several hours to spare before his delivery window expired. His truck was running perfectly, weather conditions across the country were favorable, and traffic patterns indicated smooth sailing for the entire journey. Eugene felt completely confident about completing another flawless delivery, maintaining his perfect record while handling some of the most valuable cargo of his career. The specialized container sat securely in his climate-controlled trailer, monitored by sensors that confirmed optimal conditions throughout the initial stages of his eastbound journey. Around noon on his first day, while crossing Arizona on Interstate 40, Eugene received an unexpected phone call from the research facility in Boston, thanking him for the successful delivery of their biological samples and commenting on his exceptional punctuality. The caller expressed satisfaction with the condition of the cargo and confirmed that all materials had been received in perfect condition exactly on schedule. Eugene was initially confused by the call, since he was still over 2,000 miles from Boston and wouldn't arrive for at least another day, but when he explained his current location, The facility staff insisted they had already received and processed the delivery he was supposed to make. Eugene contacted his dispatching company to clarify the situation, but found that their tracking system showed his delivery as completed successfully in Boston, despite his GPS location clearly indicating he was still in Arizona. The biotechnology company that had shipped the cargo confirmed that they had received notification of successful delivery with all required documentation and signatures. Eugene's electronic logging system showed a completed round trip from San Diego to Boston and back, with detailed records of fuel stops, rest breaks, and delivery procedures that he had no memory of performing and couldn't have physically completed given his actual location and timeline. The specialized container in Eugene's trailer began exhibiting unusual behavior that seemed connected to the mysterious delivery confirmations he was receiving. The container's internal monitoring system showed that its contents had been removed and replaced multiple times during the journey, despite the unit never being opened and remaining under constant security seals. Temperature and atmospheric readings from inside the container indicated it was empty, but visual inspection confirmed that the original cargo was still properly secured within the climate-controlled environment. Eugene's trailer sensors showed the same discrepancy, registering the container as both occupied and empty depending on which monitoring system he consulted. Eugene decided to continue toward Boston, despite the confusion, hoping to resolve the delivery mystery by completing his assignment as planned. However, as he drove eastward, he began encountering evidence that he had already traveled this route recently. Truck stop employees in New Mexico and Texas greeted him as a returning customer, showing him fuel receipts from previous visits he didn't remember making. Hotel clerks at stops where he'd never stayed thanked him for his business and asked about his return journey. Eugene's fuel card showed transactions at locations he was visiting for the first time, and several truck stops had video surveillance footage showing his truck and his own physical presence at times when he knew he had been elsewhere. Eugene's CB radio began receiving communications that appeared to be related to the completion of his Boston delivery. He heard discussions between dispatchers and other drivers about his successful cargo handling, punctual performance, and professional service during a delivery that he hadn't yet made. When Eugene tried to clarify his actual location and timeline, other drivers confirmed seeing him in Boston and described conversations they'd had with him at East Coast truck stops he'd never visited. The communication confusion extended to his family, who received calls from Eugene describing his successful Boston delivery and his plans for the return journey to California. During his second night on the road, somewhere in Oklahoma, Eugene experienced the most disturbing aspect of the delivery phenomenon when he observed his own truck traveling in the opposite direction on the interstate. The eastbound truck appeared identical to his own rig, carrying the same specialized container and driven by someone who looked exactly like Eugene himself. When Eugene tried to contact the other driver using CB radio, he received his own voice responding with detailed information about completing the Boston delivery and beginning the return journey to San Diego. The other truck's performance and behavior were identical to Eugene's own driving style and professional habits. Eugene's attempts to photograph or document the duplicate truck resulted in images that showed only empty highway, despite the clear visual evidence of the other vehicle's presence. His dash camera recorded normal traffic conditions without any indication of the identical truck he was observing, but the audio track contained CB radio conversations between Eugene and himself about delivery logistics and route planning. Eugene's GPS tracking system showed two separate positions for his truck simultaneously, one reflecting his actual location and another indicating successful delivery completion in Boston with immediate return journey initiation. The biotechnology cargo Eugene was transporting began generating its own documentation and chain of custody records that indicated successful delivery despite the container never leaving his trailer. Eugene's shipping manifests updated automatically to show completed delivery signatures and receiving party confirmations from Boston Research Facility personnel he'd never met. The specialized container's security systems recorded multiple opening and closing cycles that corresponded to standard delivery procedures, but Eugene had no memory of accessing the container, and its seals remained intact throughout his observation. Eugene arrived in Boston to find that the research facility had no record of expecting his delivery, having already received their biological samples 2 days earlier from a driver they described as identical to Eugene in appearance and professional demeanor. The facility staff showed Eugene documentation proving they'd received the exact cargo he was transporting, complete with his signature on delivery receipts and his truck's identification numbers on their receiving records. The specialized container Eugene had transported from San Diego was identical to one that had already been delivered, creating a duplication that neither shipping nor receiving parties could explain. Eugene's delivery completion triggered automatic payment processing for successful cargo transport, but his company's records showed he had already been paid for the same delivery several days earlier. His client satisfaction ratings reflected excellent performance on the Boston assignment, with detailed feedback about his professionalism and punctuality during a delivery experience he had no memory of completing. Eugene's maintenance records showed vehicle service and repairs related to the cross-country journey that had somehow been performed before he'd actually made the trip. The return journey to San Diego became a repetition of the same phenomenon in reverse, with Eugene encountering evidence of his own previous travel along the same route at times when he knew he'd been traveling eastward. Truck stops where he'd stopped on his way to Boston now had records of serving him on return journeys he hadn't yet completed, and other drivers referenced conversations about his successful delivery that had occurred in the future from Eugene's perspective. Eugene's truck appeared to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, completing deliveries before assignments were given and traveling routes before directions were provided. Eugene's perfect delivery record remained intact, but his understanding of linear time and singular existence became fundamentally altered by experiences that suggested he was somehow operating multiple versions of the same delivery simultaneously. He began accepting assignments with the knowledge that his cargo might be delivered before he began transporting it, and that his client's satisfaction might be confirmed before he met their requirements. Eugene's truck appeared to exist in a transportation reality where cause and effect followed different rules than conventional logistics operations. Eugene currently operates his delivery service with supernatural efficiency, consistently completing assignments before their deadlines despite following normal transportation procedures and timelines. His clients receive their cargo with perfect timing and condition, but Eugene experiences delivery scenarios that occur outside conventional temporal sequences. Whether this phenomenon represents time distortion, parallel reality operation, or Eugene's evolution into a transportation professional who transcends normal logistical limitations remains unexplored, but his truck continues providing delivery services that somehow complete themselves through mechanisms that defy understanding of how cargo moves between origin and destination points. Other drivers report encountering multiple versions of Eugene's truck on highways throughout the United States, all apparently traveling simultaneously between the same origin and destination points but at different stages of identical delivery assignments. Eugene maintains normal CB radio communications about logistics, route planning, and industry matters, but his operations occur in transportation realities where deliveries can be completed before they begin and cargo can arrive before it's shipped. The biotechnology company in San Diego continues contracting Eugene's services for their most critical deliveries, achieving perfect success rates and customer satisfaction, despite never quite understanding how their cargo reaches destinations with such exceptional reliability. Eugene's reputation as the industry's most dependable delivery specialist has become legendary, but the mechanism behind his perfect performance operates through transportation physics that exist parallel to conventional trucking operations and challenge basic assumptions about how cargo moves through space and time between shipping and receiving locations. Story 10. The Road That Remembered Miranda. Iron Lady. Rodriguez had been driving the same route between Phoenix and Las Vegas for 11 years, hauling casino supplies, entertainment equipment, and hospitality goods for businesses that operated around the clock in both cities. At 39, she was known throughout the Southwest Corridor for her encyclopedic knowledge of every mile of highway between the two destinations, including alternate routes, construction schedules, and the precise locations of every truck stop, way station, and emergency service facility. Miranda had driven this route over 3,000 times, accumulating more than 1 million miles on the same stretch of highway that had become as familiar to her as her own neighborhood. Her expertise on this specific corridor made her invaluable to companies that needed absolutely reliable transportation between Phoenix and Las Vegas on demanding schedules. Miranda's intimate familiarity with the route had developed into something approaching supernatural awareness of road conditions, traffic patterns, and potential hazards that allowed her to navigate the desert highway with extraordinary efficiency and safety. She could predict weather changes, construction delays, and mechanical problems before they became serious issues, maintaining perfect on-time delivery performance even when other drivers encountered unexpected obstacles. Miranda's truck was equipped with advanced monitoring systems, but she relied more on her intuitive understanding of the highway's characteristics and her ability to sense subtle changes in road conditions that weren't immediately apparent to less experienced drivers. On July 19, 2023, Miranda began what she expected to be a routine Phoenix-Las Vegas run, hauling electronic gaming equipment and luxury furnishings for a casino renovation project. The cargo was valuable but not particularly challenging to transport, and the delivery schedule allowed plenty of time for her to complete the journey with her usual precision and professionalism. Miranda left Phoenix at dawn, following her standard route on US 93 through desert terrain she'd traversed thousands of times before. Everything about the morning felt completely normal as she began the familiar journey that had defined her trucking career for over a decade. Approximately 2 hours into her journey, while traveling through the remote desert section between Phoenix and Las Vegas, Miranda began noticing that the highway was exhibiting memories of her previous trips along the same route. The asphalt surface showed wear patterns and markings that reflected not just current traffic, but specifically the tracks and impacts from Miranda's own truck during thousands of previous journeys. Lane markers appeared to be more faded in the exact positions where Miranda typically drove, and guardrails showed scratches and contact marks that corresponded to incidents from years of her own travel history along this corridor. The highway's memory phenomenon intensified as Miranda continued northwest, with the road surface beginning to display visual echoes of her past trips that became increasingly distinct and interactive. Miranda could see tire tracks from her previous journeys layered over current pavement, creating a palimpsest of her driving history that stretched back years. The tracks showed not just where she'd driven, but how she'd driven, reflecting her speed, steering patterns, and braking behaviors during specific trips that Miranda remembered taking under particular weather or traffic conditions. The highway was somehow retaining and displaying a complete record of her driving performance over more than a decade of regular travel. Miranda's CB radio began receiving transmissions that appeared to be her own voice from previous trips along the same route, discussing road conditions, delivery schedules, and mechanical issues that reflected conversations she'd had with dispatchers and other drivers during past journeys. The radio communications weren't random recordings, but seemed to be activated by Miranda's current location and driving behavior, playing back her own voice from specific points along the highway where she'd made similar communications in the past. When Miranda tried responding to these transmissions, she received answers from her past self that reflected the context and circumstances of whatever previous trip was being replayed through the highway's memory systems. As Miranda approached familiar landmarks and truck stops, she observed that these locations were displaying visual overlays of her previous visits, showing ghostly images of herself refueling, conducting vehicle inspections, and interacting with other travelers during thousands of past stops along the route. The truck stops appeared to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, with current operations overlaid by shadows of Miranda's previous visits that reflected her habits, preferences, and routine behaviors during years of regular travel. Fuel attendants who had served Miranda countless times seemed to be responding not just to her current visit, but to the cumulative impression of all her previous interactions at the same locations. The highway's memory phenomenon began affecting Miranda's truck itself, which started exhibiting performance characteristics that reflected the accumulated wear and adaptation from thousands of trips along the same route. Miranda's engine performance, transmission behavior, and suspension responses seemed to be influenced by the highway's memory of how her truck had operated during previous journeys, creating a feedback loop between the road's recorded experience and her vehicle's current behavior. Miranda's truck was somehow communicating with the highway's memory systems, accessing information about optimal performance parameters based on years of successful travel along the same corridor. Miranda's delivery. Documentation began showing entries that reflected not just her current journey, but cumulative information from thousands of previous trips along the Phoenix-Las Vegas route. Her logbook contained references to road conditions, weather patterns, and traffic situations that spanned years of travel history, with entries that seemed to be written by versions of herself from different time periods, but all related to the same basic journey between the same destinations. Miranda's own handwriting appeared in entries that described past trips with the kind of detail and accuracy that suggested the highway itself was helping her maintain records of her extensive travel history. The most disturbing aspect of the highway's memory phenomenon occurred when Miranda began encountering other versions of herself, traveling the same route at different stages of her 11-year career. She could see her own truck from previous years sharing the highway with her current vehicle, driven by past versions of herself that reflected her appearance and driving style from different periods of her professional development. These encounters weren't simple hallucinations or illusions, but interactive experiences where past and present versions of Miranda could communicate with each other through CB radio and share information about road conditions and cargo handling techniques. Miranda realized that the highway had been recording and retaining every aspect of her travel behavior over more than a decade, creating a comprehensive database of her professional expertise that was somehow being integrated with the physical infrastructure of the route itself. The road surface, signage, and support facilities had adapted to Miranda's specific driving patterns and needs, optimizing themselves to provide the most efficient and safe travel experience based on extensive analysis of her previous performance. The highway had become personalized to Miranda's individual requirements as a professional driver, reflecting years of mutual adaptation between human operator and transportation infrastructure. The cargo Miranda was transporting began exhibiting properties that suggested it had been influenced by the highway's memory of similar shipments she'd carried during previous trips. Electronic gaming equipment that should have been new from the manufacturer showed performance characteristics and configuration settings that reflected years of successful operation in Las Vegas casinos, as if the highway's memory was somehow preconditioning her cargo based on knowledge of where it would ultimately be installed and how it would be used. Miranda's delivery manifest contained information about equipment maintenance and operational history that corresponded to successful installations from her previous similar deliveries. Miranda arrived in Las Vegas to find that her casino clients were expecting not just her current delivery, but were prepared to receive equipment and furnishings that had been optimized specifically for their facilities based on Miranda's extensive knowledge of their requirements accumulated over years of regular deliveries. The casino staff commented on Miranda's exceptional understanding of their needs and her ability to provide exactly the right products configured precisely for their operations, despite Miranda having no conscious knowledge of the specific customizations they were referencing. Her delivery was accepted with gratitude for service that exceeded normal transportation requirements. Miranda's return journey to Phoenix revealed that the highway's memory systems were now incorporating her current trip into their comprehensive database, adding new information to the accumulated record of her travel history while continuing to provide access to years of previous experience. The road had become a repository of Miranda's professional knowledge and expertise, allowing her to access the wisdom gained from thousands of successful deliveries while contributing new insights from each additional journey. Miranda realized that she had evolved beyond being simply a driver who used the highway into becoming an integral component of the transportation infrastructure itself. The psychological impact of discovering that the highway remembered every detail of her professional career forced Miranda to reconsider her relationship with the route that had defined her identity as a trucker. She began thinking of the Phoenix-Las Vegas corridor not as a road she traveled, but as a partner in her transportation business that had learned her methods, adapted to her needs, and was actively supporting her success through mechanisms that transcended normal infrastructure capabilities. Miranda's driving became more intuitive and efficient as she learned to work with the highway's memory systems rather than simply traveling over passive asphalt. Miranda currently operates her Phoenix-Las Vegas transportation service with supernatural efficiency, achieving delivery performance that consistently exceeds industry standards through her partnership with highway infrastructure that has evolved specifically to support her operations. Her clients receive service that reflects over a decade of accumulated expertise and route optimization. But Miranda experiences transportation scenarios that exist outside conventional relationships between drivers and roads. The highway continues learning from each of Miranda's trips, building an ever more sophisticated understanding of optimal transportation practices while providing Miranda with access to the collective wisdom of her entire career. Other drivers report encountering Miranda on the Phoenix-Las Vegas corridor, where her truck appears to be operating with unprecedented efficiency and road awareness, demonstrating performance capabilities that suggest access to information sources beyond normal driver experience. Miranda maintains normal CB radio communications about route conditions and industry matters, but her operations occur within a transportation reality where highways can remember, learn, and adapt to individual driver needs through mechanisms that challenge conventional understanding of how roads function as passive infrastructure rather than active partners in transportation success. The stretch of highway between Phoenix and Las Vegas has become known among experienced drivers as exhibiting unusual characteristics that seem to favor certain operators while challenging others, suggesting that the road itself has developed preferences and capabilities that extend beyond simple transportation infrastructure. Miranda's success on this route has become legendary within the trucking community, but the source of her exceptional performance operates through highway systems that exist parallel to conventional road engineering and challenge basic assumptions about the relationship between drivers and the infrastructure they depend upon for safe and efficient transportation services.